He sat alone in the small sunlit studio, her fingers hovering above the worn piano keys. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she adjusted her posture and took a deep breath. The morning light spilled across the room, catching dust in tiny sparkling particles, and she could feel the quiet energy in the air. This was her sanctuary, the place where the world outside seemed to pause, and she could lose herself entirely in the music. From the moment she had touched a piano as a child, she had known that this was where she belonged. Ever since she was very young, music had been a part of her life in ways that words could never explain. She had a natural gift, a connection to the piano that went beyond practice or technique. Even at 7, she could play melodies that made people stop and listen. Her family had encouraged her, but she had always known that what she could do went beyond their understanding. They were proud, yet quietly worried that the world might not appreciate her the way she needed to be appreciated. Today, she was preparing for something new. A local music academy had opened its doors for auditions, and though she had been playing for years, this was her first time performing in a setting like this. Her manager had accompanied her, but not with the usual encouragement she expected. He was skeptical, more interested in practicality than artistry. He had a way of looking at her dreams as if they were fragile glass, beautiful but easily broken. Just before she began, he had leaned over and said with a half smile, "If you play the piano, I'll quit." She hadn't let it bother her. She had heard doubts all her life. People often said that a woman could not be serious about music, that her style was too emotional or unconventional, but she had learned to tune out the noise. The piano was her voice, and no words from anyone else could silence it. She settled onto the piano bench, feeling the cool wood against her skin, and let her hands fall naturally on the keys. The moment her fingers touched the first notes, the room changed. It was as if the air itself had taken a deep breath and was listening. Her performance began softly, almost shyly, with a melody that rose and fell like the gentle waves of a calm sea. Each note was precise but filled with feeling. She didn't just play the piano. She spoke through it. Every chord told a story. Every pause was a breath of emotion. Every rise and fall of the melody carried her own experiences, her hopes, and her longings. People in the room leaned forward, drawn in by the intensity of her music. It was impossible to look away or think of anything else. Even her manager, who had been standing by the door with crossed arms and a hint of disbelief, felt the tension in his chest. She played for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only a few minutes. When the last note faded into silence, there was a heartbeat of quiet. Then slowly the room erupted into applause. Not just polite clapping, but genuine heartfelt appreciation. Some faces were open in astonishment. Others had tears glistening in their eyes. She had never experienced anything like it. It was one thing to play for herself, for the love of music, but to have it felt so deeply by others. It was overwhelming. Her manager's mouth was slightly open. He had expected skill, perhaps, but not this. He had expected someone talented, maybe even good enough for local recognition, but he had not expected a presence that could command the entire room with a simple melody. He had not expected someone so young to play with the confidence, sensitivity, and imagination of someone who had lived through 100 lifetimes. He realized in that moment that his joke, his doubt, had been entirely misplaced. This was no ordinary pianist. She was something rare, something extraordinary from the very beginning. After the performance, people approached her, strangers with smiles and glowing eyes, complimenting her in ways that made her blush. "I've never heard anything like that in my life," one woman said. Another young musician asked eagerly for advice, inspired by the depth and passion of her playing. She nodded politely, shy but proud. Each word, each smile, felt like a small validation of the years of hard work she had poured into her music. She had practiced endlessly, often late into the night when the rest of the world was asleep, and now she could see that the effort had not been wasted. Even with the applause and recognition, she remained humble. She knew this was only the beginning. Talent alone would not guarantee a career, and she was aware of the challenges ahead. Music could be unforgiving, and the world of performers was full of competition and doubt. But in this moment, she allowed herself a small sense of triumph. She had proven something important, not just to the room full of strangers, but to herself. Her passion was real, her talent undeniable, and her dream had found its first spark of recognition. The manager, still quiet, finally spoke. I "I didn't know it could sound like that," he said. His voice carried a mixture of surprise, awe, and a touch of embarrassment. He had underestimated her completely, and now he was forced to acknowledge that she was far beyond what anyone had expected. She smiled gently, letting him have that moment of realization. There was no need for resentment or gloating. Talent like hers spoke for itself. Later, as they left the studio, she felt a sense of quiet determination. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be critics, people who doubted her, moments when she questioned herself. But for the first time, she felt truly seen. Not just heard, but understood. Not just talented, but recognized. And in that recognition, there was power. Power to keep going. Power to shape her own future. And power to inspire others through the music that flowed naturally from her soul. The city streets outside seemed brighter, almost as if they too were celebrating her triumph. She walked with a steady step, her heart light but her mind focused. Each challenge she had faced up to this point, the long hours of practice, the skepticism of others, the quiet moments of doubt, had led her here. And she understood in that quiet, powerful way that only artists can, that her journey had only just begun. As they reached the car, the manager finally allowed himself a small, reluctant smile. "You were right," he admitted quietly. "I had no idea." She laughed softly, a sound full of warmth and relief. The tension between them, born of doubt and differing expectations, began to ease. He was not just her manager now. He had become a witness to something extraordinary. He had seen the spark that would light the path for the rest of her career. That night she returned home, the piano waiting for her in the quiet of her own room. She sat down, not to prove anything to anyone, not for recognition or applause, but because she could not imagine her life without it. Her fingers moved across the keys as naturally as breathing, each note a reflection of her joy, her passion, and her growing confidence. Music was her life, and she understood with clarity and certainty that it had always been her calling. In the days that followed, people continued to talk about her performance. Invitations came for small concerts, and soon larger opportunities began to appear on the horizon. She did not rush. She took each chance thoughtfully, mindful of the responsibility that came with her talent. Every note she played was more than music. It was a story, a message, a part of herself she shared with the world. And though she faced challenges ahead, she faced them with a calm, quiet confidence that came from knowing she had always been extraordinary. Her story was only beginning, and yet in that small sunlit studio, surrounded by dust and the gentle creak of wood, she had already proven something remarkable. Talent, when combined with dedication, heart, and courage, had the power to change everything. And from that very first moment she played in front of others, it was clear to everyone who saw her that this young pianist was destined for greatness. The world was only just beginning to listen. The days that followed her first public performance were filled with a strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty. People remembered her music, and whispers of her talent began to spread quietly through the city. Invitations came in small notes or polite emails, a request to play at a local gallery, a chance to perform at a school event, and even a suggestion to join a minor music competition. Each offer carried a promise, yet also a pressure she was learning to navigate. She felt the pull between her love for music and the growing expectation that she should play for an audience that might not fully understand her vision. At home, she practiced as she always had, yet each session now carried a new weight. Her fingers, once free and playful, moved with precision and care, conscious of the whispers and the recognition building outside her door. She spent hours at the piano, exploring melodies she had only imagined in fleeting moments. Sometimes she would pause, closing her eyes, and try to capture an emotion that felt just beyond her grasp. Music was never just sound for her. It was a language of feeling, of expression, of truth. She wanted every note to reflect the depth of what she carried inside, and this became both a joy and a challenge. Her manager, who had been skeptical at first, now watched her carefully. He had seen the spark that others were beginning to notice, but he also saw her struggle. She was young, and the weight of expectation was a new experience. He tried to advise her, gently suggesting ways to make her performances more accessible, more appealing to general audiences. He would say things like, "Perhaps we can simplify this piece just a little," or maybe a shorter introduction would keep people's attention. She would listen politely, nodding, but inside, she wrestled with the idea. Her music was her voice. To change it for comfort or approval felt like a betrayal. One evening after a long practice session, she closed the piano lid and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She felt tired, not from physical effort, but from the emotional labor of balancing her passion with the expectations pressing in from every side. She knew she had to make choices. She could either bend her music to fit others' comfort, or she could remain true to herself and risk misunderstanding, criticism, or missed opportunities. The thought made her heart race, but deep down, she knew there was only one path she could take. She had always known it, even when the world seemed unsure. Soon after, the first real challenge arrived. A prominent music school offered her a place to study, but with a condition. She was asked to follow a strict curriculum, emphasizing classical forms and techniques, while discouraging improvisation or personal expression. At first, she was excited. The idea of studying at a respected institution was tempting, but as she read the guidelines, she realized that the rules would limit her creativity. She remembered the feeling she had when her fingers first danced over the keys in that small studio, when her music had been raw, free, and utterly alive. She could not give that up. Her decision was met with confusion. Her manager tried to persuade her, saying that this school could open doors, help her reputation, and give her a steady path forward. But she shook her head firmly. "I can't study this way," she said quietly. "It will take the life out of my music." There was no anger in her voice, only certainty. She wanted guidance, yes, but she also wanted the freedom to explore, to make mistakes, to grow in ways that no rigid system could define. The manager sighed, a mixture of admiration and frustration crossing his face. He realized that her path would be unconventional, and that he would need to support her in ways he had never imagined. In the weeks that followed, she began performing at small events, each one a test of her ability to connect with others. At first, audiences were uncertain. They were polite, clapping politely at the end, but some seemed confused by her style. She played with all her heart, weaving emotion into every chord. Yet the reaction was sometimes less than what she had hoped. It was a test of patience. She reminded herself that not everyone would understand immediately, and that her purpose was not to please everyone, but to be true to herself. One afternoon, she was invited to perform at a local cafe, a small venue with a warm, cozy atmosphere. The owner had heard of her talent and wanted to see it firsthand. The room was quiet when she began, filled with people sipping coffee and chatting softly. She closed her eyes, allowing the notes to flow from her fingers naturally. Slowly, the chatter faded. Each person in the room was drawn in, feeling the subtle shifts of emotion in her playing, the moments of joy, of sadness, of longing. By the time she finished, the applause was not just polite. It was heartfelt and spontaneous. Strangers approached her afterward, shaking her hand, offering words of wonder and encouragement. One elderly man with tears in his eyes whispered, "I haven't felt something like this in years." These small moments became her anchor. They reminded her why she persisted despite the doubts and challenges. The world was not ready to fully understand her, but it was beginning to listen. Slowly, quietly, recognition was forming, brick by brick, note by note. And while the manager remained cautious, he began to realize that her impact was growing in ways he had not anticipated. His earlier doubt had been replaced with a careful respect, tempered by the knowledge that she was building something far beyond ordinary measures of success. Amid the small victories, she also faced criticism. Local musicians, some envious of her talent, whispered behind her back. Critics dismissed her as too experimental, too unpredictable, or too emotional. Some said that her style could never be commercial, that she was limiting herself by refusing to conform. These comments stung, yet they did not break her. She listened, acknowledged the words, but returned to the piano with renewed determination. Every critique became a lesson, a chance to refine her technique and deepen her understanding of what she wanted to convey through music. Her evenings were often long, spent in solitude at the piano. She experimented with rhythms, tried new melodies, and sometimes improvised pieces that no one would ever hear. These private compositions were her sanctuary, a place where she could explore without judgment. In those moments, she discovered new layers of her talent, subtle nuances that would later appear in public performances. She realized that creativity could not be forced, and that patience and exploration were as important as skill. One rainy afternoon, While sitting at the piano and listening to the sound of raindrops against the window, she reflected on her journey so far. The path had not been easy, but each challenge had strengthened her resolve. She had faced skepticism, doubt, and criticism, yet she had remained committed to her art. She understood that her music was not just a skill or a hobby, it was a reflection of who she was, a language through which she could communicate what words could not capture. This realization brought her a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that no recognition or applause could fully provide. Despite the progress she was making, she knew that bigger challenges awaited. Invitations to larger events began to appear, along with opportunities to perform on stages she had only dreamed of. She understood that stepping into these spaces would require courage, confidence, and the ability to navigate the pressures of public scrutiny, but she also knew that she was ready. Each note she played, each audience she reached had prepared her for the next step. She carried with her the lessons of patience, persistence, and authenticity. Her manager, who had once joked about quitting, now found himself humbled by her determination. He realized that his role was no longer just about guidance or scheduling. It was about trust, support, and belief in something extraordinary. He had to learn to step back, to allow her space to grow in her own way, even when it defied conventional wisdom. Watching her perform, he understood that talent like hers was rare, and that trying to control it would be a mistake. Instead, he focused on helping her navigate opportunities while letting her music speak for itself. As the weeks turned into months, she continued to practice, perform, and grow. Each small success built her confidence, and each challenge strengthened her resilience. She began to notice changes within herself, a greater understanding of her own capabilities, a deeper connection to her emotions, and a stronger sense of purpose. She realized that her journey was not about fame or recognition alone, but about expressing her truth, touching others with her music, and remaining faithful to the artist she had always been. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at a local hall, she sat alone at the piano, letting her fingers rest on the keys. The room was quiet, save for the echo of applause still lingering in her memory. She closed her eyes and smiled softly, thinking about how far she had come. There had been doubt, skepticism, and criticism, yet she had remained steadfast. She had learned that the path of an artist was never easy, but it was always worth pursuing with heart, courage, and honesty. She understood, more clearly than ever, that talent alone was not enough. Dedication, perseverance, and the willingness to face challenges head-on were what would carry her forward. And she felt ready. The recognition that had begun to bloom around her was only the beginning. There were larger stages, wider audiences, and greater opportunities ahead. But no matter what came, she would stay true to her music, to her voice, and to the unique vision that had always guided her. That night, as she turned off the lights and left the studio, the city outside was quiet. Rain had stopped, leaving streets glistening under the soft glow of lamps. She walked slowly, feeling the rhythm of the world around her, her mind filled with melodies yet to be played. She carried with her the knowledge that the journey ahead would be filled with both joy and struggle, but that each note she played was a step toward the life she had always dreamed of, and in that knowledge she found peace, determination, and the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Weeks turned into months, and her name started appearing more often in local newspapers and social media posts. People were beginning to recognize her face and talk about the young woman who could make a piano sing. What had started as small performances in cafes and halls had now grown into invitations from music festivals and art shows. Yet despite her growing success, she stayed humble. Every time she sat in front of the piano, she felt the same nervous excitement she had felt that first day in the small studio. The same love, the same fear, the same fire. Her manager, who had once doubted her, now spoke of her with pride. He began to take his role more seriously, handling offers, scheduling interviews, and protecting her from the chaos that fame slowly brought. But he also noticed how she avoided the spotlight outside of her performances. She wasn't interested in being famous for the sake of fame. She cared only about the music. For her, every concert was a conversation. Tie-in with the audience, a chance to share something honest and real. Her biggest opportunity came one afternoon when she received a letter from a prestigious national talent competition. It wasn't just another event. This was the kind of stage where the country's top musicians performed, often in front of international judges. It was the type of chance that could change a person's life forever. When she read the invitation, her heart raced. It felt unreal, something she had only imagined quietly while practicing late at night. She placed the letter gently on her piano and stared at it for a long time, realizing this could be the moment that defined her career. Her manager was thrilled. "This is it," he said with excitement in his voice. "This is what we've been waiting for." But she only smiled softly and replied, "Then I'll have to make sure the music is ready." He didn't understand at first that she wasn't just talking about rehearsing. For her, preparing the music meant preparing herself, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. She wanted every note she played to be real, to carry the truth of her journey so far. The days leading up to the competition were long and demanding. She practiced until her fingers ached, sometimes losing track of time completely. The sun would rise and set outside her window, but she stayed in her own world, chasing perfection that couldn't be measured by speed or precision alone. She wasn't trying to be the best pianist in the competition. She wanted to make people feel something. She wanted her performance to touch hearts, not just impress minds. Her manager watched her from a distance, amazed by her discipline. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said one evening, concerned. She looked up and smiled faintly. "It doesn't feel hard," she answered softly. "It feels right." She didn't explain further, but he understood that her relationship with the piano was deeper than work. It was part of who she was. When the day of the competition finally arrived, the concert hall was packed. The stage was wide, gleaming under bright lights, and the air buzzed with nervous energy. Contestants from all over the country sat waiting for their turn, each with their own dreams and fears. Her manager stayed close, offering quiet encouragement, but she seemed calm, focused yet peaceful. When her name was called, she walked to the piano slowly, her steps steady and graceful. The hall fell silent. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. For a moment, she simply rested her hands on the keys without playing. That silence stretched long enough for people to begin to wonder what she was waiting for. Then, with a gentle touch, she began. Her music started soft, delicate like a whisper. The sound flowed across the room like a breeze, rising and falling with emotion. She played a piece she had written herself, something she had composed late one night when she felt completely lost. The melody told a story of struggle, of hope, of finding beauty in pain. Every note carried part of her heart, and soon the audience could feel it. The judges leaned forward, listening intently. There was something different about her playing. It wasn't just skill, it was sincerity. Halfway through, the melody grew stronger, filled with power and grace. Her fingers moved effortlessly, guided by emotion rather than thought. She wasn't performing anymore. She was simply being. Her music became a mirror of her life. The moments of doubt, the quiet perseverance, the endless passion that kept her moving forward. When the final note faded, the silence that followed felt sacred. No one clapped right away. Everyone was too moved to speak. Then slowly the applause began. Soft at first, then louder and louder until it filled the hall completely. People stood cheering and whistling, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. Her manager had tears in his eyes. He had heard her play countless times before, but never like this. This performance felt like a confession, a revelation, something divine. She stood, bowed humbly, and smiled shyly as the applause continued. She didn't crave the attention, but the reaction touched her deeply. She could see in people's faces that they had understood her music, felt it, lived it. That was all she had ever wanted. Later that night, as the results were announced, she won first place. The audience erupted in joy. Reporters rushed forward for interviews. Photographers snapped pictures, and her manager beamed with pride. Yet amidst all the excitement, she remained composed. Winning felt wonderful, but what meant more to her was the connection she had made through her music. She had touched hearts. That was the real victory. In the days that followed, news of her performance spread quickly. Videos of her playing went viral online, gathering millions of views. People from different countries shared her story, calling her the pianist who plays from the soul. She received calls from producers, agents, and orchestras offering contracts and collaborations. It was overwhelming. Her manager worked tirelessly to manage the flood of opportunities, but she remained grounded. She didn't rush to accept everything. She wanted to move forward slowly, choosing projects that felt right to her heart. However, fame also brought its challenges. With more attention came more pressure. Some critics began to question whether she could continue to deliver such emotional performances under the spotlight. Others accused her of being overrated, suggesting that her success was just temporary. Reading those harsh words stung, but she refused to let them discourage her. She knew that criticism was part of success, and she reminded herself that true artists were never free from judgment. Her manager noticed her quiet struggles and began encouraging her more often. "Don't let them change you," he told her one evening after a particularly stressful day. She nodded, appreciating his words. "I won't," she replied softly. And she meant it. To escape the noise, she started taking long walks by the river near her home. She found peace in the sound of flowing water, the rustle of leaves, and the rhythm of her own footsteps. Sometimes she brought a small notebook to jot down melodies that came to her mind. Inspiration often struck in those quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts. One evening, while sitting on a park bench watching the sunset, she overheard two children talking nearby. They were arguing about who could play the piano better. One of them mentioned her name excitedly, saying, "I want to play like her someday." The other laughed and replied, "You'll have to practice forever." Hearing that made her smile. She realized that her journey wasn't just about herself anymore. It was about inspiring others. She returned home that night with renewed energy. Sitting at her piano, she began composing a new piece. It was softer, more hopeful than anything she had written before. Each note was like a quiet promise to herself, to her listeners, to every dreamer who believed in something. She played late into the night, losing track of time as the melody filled the room. Her manager came by the next morning and found her still at the piano, eyes tired but glowing with joy. "You haven't slept, have you?" he asked, half amused. She shook her head and smiled. "I couldn't stop. The music wouldn't let me." He laughed softly. "Then don't stop," he said. "Just make sure you eat something first." In the months that followed, she continued to perform at larger venues. Her concerts sold out within hours, and people traveled from distant places just to hear her play live. She remained the same humble, soft-spoken artist she had always been. After each show, she would thank the audience quietly, bow gently, and leave the stage without fanfare. She didn't need the spotlight. She already had what she loved: the music, the connection, and the ability to move people's hearts. Her journey, however, was far from over. She had reached a new level of recognition, but she knew there were still many lessons ahead. She was learning to balance fame with peace, attention with privacy, and success with authenticity. She promised herself she would never lose sight of why she started: to express truth, emotion, and beauty through the piano. That night, as she packed for her next tour, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and smiled. She wasn't the same uncertain girl who once played in a small studio. She had grown stronger, wiser, and more confident. Yet her heart remained the same: gentle, passionate, and full of love for the music that had shaped her life. The world now saw her as a rising star, but to her she was simply a woman who loved to play. She believed that as long as she stayed true to herself, her music would continue to reach those who needed it most. And with that quiet belief, she sat at her piano once more, letting her fingers find the keys as the room filled with the soft sound of her heart speaking again, through every note she played. The tour began in early spring. The weather was mild and the air carried the promise of change. She stood backstage at a large theater, listening to the soft hum of the audience waiting for her to appear. It still amazed her how far she had come. Not long ago, she had been playing in quiet cafes and small halls. Now she stood on stages where world-famous musicians had once performed. Yet even in that grand space surrounded by cameras, microphones, and bright lights, she still felt the same way she always did before a performance: calm, focused, and ready to let the piano speak for her. Her manager stood beside her, checking his watch and whispering last-minute details about the show. She smiled gently and said, "Don't worry, it'll be fine." He nodded, realizing she didn't need reminders. The moment her fingers touched the keys, she would lose herself completely in the music. That was where she belonged. When her name was announced, the audience cheered. She walked to the piano slowly, the sound of applause surrounding her like a warm wave. The stage lights shone brightly, but she didn't feel blinded. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes flowed softly, almost like a whisper. Then the melody grew stronger, fuller, richer. Every note carried emotion, joy, sorrow, longing, peace. The audience was silent, watching her hands glide effortlessly across the keys. They could feel her passion in every movement. To them, it wasn't just music. It was storytelling through sound. When the final note faded, the silence in the hall was deep and full. Then came the applause, loud, unending, emotional. People stood to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some wiped away tears. She smiled humbly, bowed, and walked off stage. Backstage, her manager was waiting, his eyes wide with pride. "You did it again," he said softly. She only nodded, her heart still caught in the emotion of the moment. That night marked the beginning of a long journey, a series of performances that took her from city to city, country to country. Every stage had its own charm, every audience its own energy. She played in grand concert halls with red velvet curtains, in quiet open-air gardens under the stars, and even in small towns where people had never heard live piano music before. No matter where she went, she gave everything she had to the music. Yet with every success came new challenges. Fame brought not only admiration but also pressure. Reporters wanted interviews, critics wanted headlines, and organizers expected perfection every night. It was exhausting. Her schedule grew tighter and rest became a luxury. Still, she refused to compromise on her performance. She believed that every person who came to hear her deserved her full heart, her full energy, no matter how tired she was. But the more her name grew, the more others tried to shape her image. Some producers suggested changing her style to make her music more modern. Others wanted her to collaborate with popular singers or appear in television shows. She listened politely but rarely agreed. "My music is my story," she told her manager quietly one evening. "If I change that, I'll lose who I am." He respected that. He had learned long ago that her connection to her art was not something to be negotiated. Despite her calm strength, the pace of fame began to wear on her. Traveling constantly, being away from home, and always being under the public eye took its toll. There were moments when she felt lonely, even in a room full of people. Her performances were full of emotion, but once the applause ended and the lights dimmed, silence returned, a silence that sometimes felt heavy. One evening, after a concert in another busy city, she sat alone in her hotel room. The room was beautiful, yet it felt cold and distant. She looked out of the window at the city lights below twinkling like stars, and wondered if this was the price of success, to be loved by thousands but known by none. She missed the simple days of practicing alone, when music was just between her and the piano. Fame had brought her recognition, but it had also taken away the quiet peace she once knew. Her manager knocked gently on the door, holding 2 cups of tea. "You haven't eaten," he said softly. She turned, managing a small smile. "I wasn't hungry," she replied. He set the tea down beside her and sat quietly for a moment. "You know," he said, "when I first met you, I didn't understand what made you special. I thought you were just another young musician with a dream. But I was wrong. You're not just talented, you're real. People feel that. Don't lose it." His words touched her. She didn't answer immediately, but she nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. In that moment, she promised herself that no matter how far she went, she would stay grounded in the same passion that had started it all. Over the next few months, she began to find balance again. Between performances, she took time to rest, to write, to walk through parks in the cities she visited. Sometimes she visited local music schools, spending time with young students who looked at her with admiration. She listened to their stories, answered their questions, and played for them. Seeing their excitement reminded her why she had started in the first place. Their innocence and enthusiasm reignited something in her heart that fame had started to dull. One afternoon, after a school visit in a small town, a young girl approached her timidly. "When I play the piano, no one listens," the girl said. "They say I'll never be good enough." She knelt down and smiled kindly. "Play anyway," she said. "Play for yourself first. If you love it, the world will listen one day." The girl smiled shyly, and in her eyes she saw a reflection of her younger self, full of dreams, full of uncertainty, but with a spark waiting to shine. Her words were not just advice to the girl, but a reminder to herself. That night she sat alone at the piano again, in the quiet of her hotel room. She closed her eyes and began to play, Not for an audience, not for fame, but for her own heart. The music flowed freely, full of peace and clarity. It felt like coming home. Soon she started writing new compositions. These were different from her earlier works, deeper, more personal, filled with the quiet wisdom she had gained through experience. When she performed them for the first time, audiences noticed the change. Her music carried new emotion, not just passion, but also reflection, acceptance, and grace. The critics who once doubted her now began to praise her growth. They wrote about the depth and maturity in her playing, calling her one of the most soulful pianists of her generation. But she paid little attention to the reviews. What mattered to her was the connection she felt each time she played, the stillness that came when music filled the air and everything else faded away. Despite her calm presence, life on the road continued to be demanding. There were nights when exhaustion threatened to break her focus, and days when she missed home so much it hurt. But whenever she thought about stopping, she remembered the faces in her audience, the people who found comfort, hope, or courage in her music. That was enough to keep her going. During one particularly special concert, held in a massive open-air arena, something unexpected happened. The audience was enormous, stretching far into the distance. As she played, a gentle breeze swept across the stage, carrying her music into the night air. Halfway through her piece, she looked up and saw people swaying with closed eyes, completely lost in the moment. Some held hands, some smiled softly, some cried quietly. It was as if her music had united thousands of strangers in one shared feeling. When she finished, the applause seemed to go on forever. It wasn't loud just because of excitement. It was full of love and gratitude. She bowed deeply, her heart full. In that instant, she understood something profound. Fame was never about being seen. It was about being felt, and she realized that she had achieved exactly what she had always wanted, to reach people's hearts without needing to say a word. That night, as she left the stage, her manager walked beside her. "You've changed," he said softly. She looked at him curiously. "How?" she asked. He smiled. "You used to play like someone trying to prove herself. Now you play like someone who's already found what she was looking for." She didn't reply, but the truth in his words made her chest tighten with emotion. Later, back in her hotel room, she sat by the window and watched the stars. Her hands rested on her lap, still tingling from the performance. She thought about everything that had happened, the early doubts, the endless practice, the struggles, the victories, the loneliness, the joy. Every step, every note had led her here. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "This is what it means to live through music." The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, she felt lighter. There were still concerts to play, still miles to travel, still lessons to learn, but she no longer feared the future. She had discovered something more valuable than fame: peace. Her music now carried not only her story but also the stories of everyone she had met along the way: the hopeful children, the strangers who cried during her songs, the manager who had once doubted her, but had become her greatest supporter. Her journey was no longer about proving anything. It was about giving emotion, giving comfort, giving truth. And so as her tour continued, she played each night with the same quiet strength she had always carried within her. Every note she played reminded the world, and herself, that real success isn't about applause or awards, but about touching lives and staying true to who you are. Months passed and her tour was slowly coming to an end. The final concert was set to take place in her home country, the place where everything had started. The news spread quickly and the excitement was beyond anything she had ever imagined. People who had followed her journey from the very beginning waited eagerly for her return. The concert hall sold out within hours. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had gone from a quiet, unknown pianist to one of the world's most respected musicians. As the date drew closer, she spent her days in quiet reflection. She was no longer the same woman who had once been mocked for her dream. The struggles, the loneliness, and the triumphs had shaped her into someone wiser and calmer. Yet deep inside, she still carried the same heart, the one that had fallen in love with the sound of piano keys when she was just a child. On the morning of the final concert, she woke up early. The soft sunlight came through the curtains of her old family home, and the familiar smell of the neighborhood filled the air. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The same window she had once looked out from as a young girl, dreaming of playing for the world. So much had changed, yet that dreamer inside her felt the same. Later that afternoon, she visited the small music school where she had learned her first lessons. The building was older now. The walls faded, but stepping inside brought back memories that warmed her heart. She ran her fingers along the old piano keys that still stood in the corner. Dust covered the surface, but when she pressed one key, it gave a soft, familiar sound. A smile touched her lips. "Still sounds the same," she whispered. The school's current teacher, an elderly man with kind eyes, recognized her immediately. "You came back," he said warmly. She nodded. "I wanted to see where it all began." They sat together for a while, talking about the past, about the days when she could barely reach the pedals, about her endless practice sessions, about the times she cried because she thought she'd never be good enough. "You've gone far," the old man said proudly, "but you've kept your heart in the right place. That's rare." His words stayed with her long after she left the building. That evening, she stood backstage at the grand concert hall, listening to the audience settle into their seats. The hall was packed. Musicians, critics, old friends, and new fans. Somewhere in the crowd were the people who had once doubted her, and those who had quietly believed in her all along. She took a deep breath, her hands calm and steady. Her manager, who had been with her through everything, walked over with a small smile. "It's your night," he said softly. She looked at him and replied, "No, it's music's night." When her name was announced, the audience erupted in applause. She walked to the piano, her gown glimmering under the lights. She bowed, then sat down. The room fell silent. For a long moment, she didn't play. She just looked at the instrument before her, the same kind of piano that had been both her friend and her escape all her life. Then with a deep breath, she began. The first notes floated into the air, soft, gentle, like a memory being told through sound. Every melody carried emotion, the pain of her early struggles, the joy of her victories, the quiet peace she had found along the way. She wasn't just performing, she was sharing her life's journey with the audience through each note. As she played, faces in the crowd softened. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music carry them away. Others smiled, remembering her story. How she had once been underestimated, how she had proved her worth not with words, but with music. Even those who had once mocked her sat still, humbled by the beauty before them. Halfway through, she paused for a brief moment, letting the sound fade completely. The silence that followed was powerful, almost sacred. Then she began to play again, a piece she had composed herself, one no one had heard before. It was slow, emotional, and full of depth. It spoke of dreams, of forgiveness, of gratitude. As the final note lingered in the air, she lifted her hands and let the sound fade into silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the entire hall rose to its feet and the applause began. Loud, unending, heartfelt. Some people were crying. Others shouted her name. Flowers were thrown onto the stage. But she didn't smile because of the applause. She smiled because she felt complete. Her manager came to her side as the curtain closed. "You've done it," he said quietly. "You've given them something they'll never forget." She turned to him and replied, "It's not me. It's the music that did that." After the concert, reporters wanted interviews, photographers wanted pictures, and fans waited in long lines for autographs. But before meeting anyone, she took a few minutes alone in her dressing room. She looked at herself in the mirror, not at the elegant dress or the awards displayed on the table, but at her eyes. They were tired but peaceful. It was all worth it, she whispered to her reflection. Later, when she stepped outside, she saw a young boy waiting near the exit. He was holding a small music notebook in his hands. "Can you sign this?" he asked shyly. She smiled and took the book. "Do you play?" she asked. He nodded eagerly. "Yes, but I'm not very good. My teacher says I need to practice more." She knelt down and handed him the signed notebook. "Then practice," she said gently. "Don't play to be perfect. Play to feel. The rest will follow." The boy grinned, and she saw in his eyes the same spark she had once had. The following day, the concert made headlines around the world. Critics called it a masterpiece, like a soul-stirring performance, like a night of pure magic. But she didn't read much of it. She had already moved on in her mind. Fame, she knew now, was temporary. What lasted was the love people carried in their hearts after hearing her music. With the tour officially over, she decided to take a long break from the stage. She moved to a quiet countryside home, far away from the noise of the cities. There, surrounded by nature, she found peace again. The days were slow and calm. She would spend mornings walking by the river, afternoons writing new melodies, and evenings watching the sunset while sipping tea. Sometimes her manager would visit, bringing letters from fans or invitations for new concerts. But she would smile and say, "Not yet. I still have music to write." He understood. She wasn't running away from the world. She was simply returning to where it all began, to the pure joy of creating. In that quiet home, she composed some of her most beautiful pieces. They were softer, gentler, reflections of a heart at peace. She didn't plan to release them, but one day her manager convinced her to share just one. It was a simple melody called Homecoming. When it was released, it touched millions. People wrote to her saying it reminded them of love, family, childhood, and forgiveness. She read those letters quietly, smiling. Years went by, and though she performed less often, her name continued to live on. Young musicians spoke of her with admiration. Her story became an inspiration, not just for pianists, but for anyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. She had shown that greatness wasn't born out of pride, but out of persistence, humility, and heart. One winter morning, she sat by her piano, now older, but still graceful. Her hands had grown slower, but her touch was still full of emotion. She played softly, eyes closed, completely lost in the music. The room was filled with warmth, even though snow fell outside. It was peaceful. Just her, the piano, and the quiet rhythm of life. She paused for a moment and looked out the window, thinking about everything she had lived through, the laughter, the tears, the stages, the journeys, the faces of people who had listened to her. "Thank you," she whispered softly, as if speaking to the piano itself. That evening, her manager, now gray-haired but still devoted, called to check on her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Peaceful," she replied with a smile. "I think I've played every song my heart wanted to play." And she truly had. Her legacy continued through her recordings, her compositions, and the countless lives she had touched. Music schools began teaching her pieces as examples of pure emotional storytelling. Children played her songs at recitals. Teachers spoke about her journey, and every performance of her work reminded people that behind every great artist is not just talent, but a story of struggle, patience, and love. Years later, during a tribute concert held in her honor, one of her students performed her most famous piece. As the final note echoed through the hall, the audience rose to their feet, applauding just as they had years ago. On the big screen behind the stage was a photo of her smiling at her piano. Beneath it were the words she had once said in an interview. "Music doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who listens and feels something they can't explain." And in that moment, her spirit seemed to fill the room, gentle, timeless, full of grace. The applause carried on, not for fame, not for perfection, but for the soul of a woman who had turned her life into music. Her journey had started with a single dream, a dream to play. She had faced doubt, pain, and loneliness, but she never gave up. From being mocked for her passion to becoming a legend the world would never forget, her life was proof that true greatness doesn't come from recognition. It comes from staying true to who you are, no matter what others say. And somewhere, maybe in another quiet room, a child pressed down on a piano key for the first time, unaware that they were walking the same path, the path she had once walked, and that her music would be there, waiting to guide them.